All right, everyone, we're gonna get started. We have one extra speaker who should be arriving. That's John McTurnan, but we'll have to wait and see. I'm now thinking that maybe this will be a spectre that haunts the whole evening. That John is going to arrive, and never arrives. But we'll see. Anyway, so hi everyone. My name is Will Strong. I'm the Chief Executive and Co-Director of the Autonomy Institute, which is the host of tonight's event. We are a think tank and consultancy which helps think about the future of work, welfare and climate, but also tries to bring it into being with various pilots. So we also do lots of pilots around 4-day weeks, around basic income and other kind of workplace policies too. So if you want to check out our work, it's at autonomy.work. Enough about the organization. Oh, this is also a Macrodose live event as well. So shout out to Macrodose. I'm sure we all know what that is. And it's going to go live. Yes. Yeah, news to Aisha. This is actually a live podcast as well. This will be going out next week, I believe, Freddie tells me. So looking forward to that. So hello to future listeners and viewers of this online. So this is, I've made this joke too many times today, but this is the season finale of Forum 2029 and seemingly the season finale of politics in general. We've had, this is the 7th event in the series of Forum 2029, which is a series conceived by those at Autonomy, but also wider colleagues from across the left movement. Jeremy Gilbert's here, and a bunch of others who've been kind of thinking this through for the past year. We have run a number of series. The premise of, sorry, number of events. The premise of the event really is trying to build consensus about what a shared program for the left and centre left, progressives more generally, would look like, given the challenges we face and the seeming inertia at the top of government, which I think we can all agree is partly the cause of the problems we have today. So we've had 6 kind of deep dives into different policy areas. We looked at work, income and tax. We've looked at food and energy and water. We've looked at the relationship between the UK and the global south in terms of living standards, a whole range of things, and they're all online now. Most of them are online now, but they will be online very soon. And all of that is going to be condensed into a report, a kind of a expression of what that shared policy program might be. Now, this is the first series. We're happy to say we have funding for a second series, to sound a bit like Alan Partridge. Yes, we've got a second series. That second series will be happening next year, and we're going to be working towards, obviously, 2029, the date of the next general election. So we're going to be keeping this format, and we're going to be bringing more and more people, more MPs, more trade unionists, more practitioners, as we have been from the start of this series, into the following series. So please come along to those. Half of them are online, half are in person. The in-person ones, obviously, are much better, in my opinion, for this kind of interaction. Okay, so this is the season finale. So I guess the premise of today's event is actually, there's a bit more freedom for our speakers, really, because we've been having these quite, almost technical deep dives into what should the policy around work and tax and incomes be, or food and energy and water and so on. Whereas the simple tagline for tonight's event has been the politics and policies we need, basically, which is a hugely broad kind of theme, but one which I think our speakers tonight are really. And in fact, John McDon is here. Welcome, John. Please. We have a great bunch of speakers tonight to speak to precisely that, the politics and policies that we need. All come from different backgrounds and actually in their day-to-day work focus on different areas. So I'm really looking forward to seeing this discussion. Thanks, John. Okay, I'm going to introduce each speaker as we go. And we're going to broadly go in kind of this. That doesn't make any sense, but we're going to go in a certain order. And there's going to be, the format is 10 minutes to speak on that issue. And I think they're going to be taking it in different ways. And then we're going to have about 40 minutes for open discussion. And as you can imagine, a lot to discuss. I don't need to go into the political context of today. Before this talk, we were having about half-hour chat about the march that happened last weekend. That context, I think, is very much in everyone's mind as we go into thinking about what politics and policies we need. I should shout out, we have support for this series from University of East London, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and the Alex Ferry Foundation, who've been generous enough to support the series. And also we have to collaborate with Macrodose on each of the recordings and Planet B Productions. Okay, that's enough of an introduction to what this is and what this will be. I'm going to move to our first speaker. Aisha Thomas-Smith is the director or CEO of NEON? Exec director, baby, of NEON, the New Economy Organisers Network, which I'm sure a lot of you know. do fantastic work. They've been doing it for 10, 15 years? 10 years, which is quite a remarkable achievement. And I can't think of anyone better to kind of kick off tonight's event. So yeah, Aisha, 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Will, and thanks for having me. So yeah, as Will said, I'm the ED of NEON. Some of you know, we build the power of social movements, and we work across a range of different issues, and we use a range of different tools. So I thought what I could do today was just give you a little bit of a snapshot from the different issues that we work on that we call battlegrounds, and the different tools that we use to kind of do a little bit of scene setting at the beginning. And then each of our wonderful speakers will dive in more detail, I'm sure. So I need to press start. I don't need to tell people in this room how bad things are, but I will anyway. We are living through one of the hardest times that I can remember. Whether it's the cost of living crisis, plummeting trust in politics as a means of achieving change, crumbling infrastructure, the planet on fire, I could go on and on. And as we know, these things are caused by deliberate political choices that put profits before people, and also a political class that is really dedicated to maintaining that status quo. It's no wonder so many people are turning to reform, which I'm sure will be a big theme of the night, who are offering simple solutions to complex problems that are really kind of communicated through the politics of grievance. The current government, in my opinion, is woefully unwilling or unable to tackle these problems head on. They won't pick political enemies because their entire project is based on debunked trickle-down economics, incentivizing big business, cut the red tape, cull the bats and the newts, and we all get rich, aka growth. Don't love growth? What a surprise. The people who they are willing to pick a fight with, though, are the disabled and the elderly and migrants and a lot of the folks in this room, so that's encouraging. The sad truth is that this government strategy of appease, divide, and distract is not only ineffective, but it also plays right into the hands of the far right, who are stronger than they've been in decades, as we've said. So as I said, NEON exists to build the power of social movements and to push the conversation and the country to the left. And our strategic orientation for the duration of this government really is to change the starting point for all of you kind of folks, us kind of folks, from what do we agree on to what can we win together? Because we think that basically now more than ever, we can't afford not to ask ourselves that question. We work on a range of different battleground issues under the banner of a fight for a new economy. So I'm going to give you a snapshot of just one thing that's happening in each of those areas that I think we should pay attention to. So starting with migration. Reform are really using the US rights playbook when it comes to asylum hotels, as we know, and so what they've done is they found a very niche piece of legislation, and then they use it to force the hand of the powers that be. So the way, for example, that they got the hotel shut down in Epping was to challenge it under the terms of building use clause in the Hotel Licensing Act. It's very sexy, which basically left the judge with no choice really but to capitulate and to introduce a system whereby if someone wanted to turn their hotel into an asylum hotel, they had to appeal to the reform-led council, who would of course reject it. These kinds of tactics are in fact pretty sophisticated, and we need to be better at both understanding that and employing them ourselves. But what's interesting about this is what the judge didn't have to do, but chose to, is state that one of his reasons for agreeing to the appeal was the civil unrest caused by the protesters outside of the hotel, which sets the precedent, of course, that basically says if you protest against these hotels, you might be able to get them shut down, which brings me on to my next area, civil liberties. I don't need to go into detail about the chilling effect that the ridiculous designation of Palestine Action as a terrorist organization has had on our movements and on the wider context of civil liberties in general. But one thing I will say is a direct quote given to me by a senior Labour official just after they got elected. We're going to create a country where there's no need to protest. So why are you so upset? Direct quote. Terrifying. Climate. So I think it's been said to me now on 4 different occasions that we've basically lost when it comes to the climate agenda, and Reform, with the tacit support of Labour, have succeeded in undermining taking any action on it. And so we basically just need to accept that and target our efforts elsewhere. I don't know about you, but I don't accept that at all. In my opinion, not only is that not true, polling suggests that public support for net zero policies, for example, is still really high. But I think it's dangerous to even entertain that narrative. And I'm sure Assad will be able to say more on this, as will other panelists. And the final area is the rise of the far right itself. So there's, of course, a lot I could say on this. We could spend an hour just dissecting the motivations of the 100,000 plus people who attended the Unite the Kingdom rally this weekend, but we don't have much time, so I just wanted to lift up some highlights from Nigel Farage's speech at the Reform Conference, which I watched, so most of you don't have to. You're welcome, although I'm sure you all did. So there wasn't much coherence in terms of their policy agenda, perhaps surprisingly. It's all about vibes. There were fireworks, there was glitter, and situating them as the only real alternative to the corrupt two main parties. There was a lot of red meat for the base, stop the boats, down with red ed and renewables. But ironically, as the self-proclaimed party of the people, there was very little on solutions to the cost of living crisis. And also, ironically, a big focus on civil liberties, freedom of speech, shutting down the Human Rights Act, et cetera, which is really interesting when we compare this to Labour's current approach. Organising and ground game and building the sense of community was also really critical to their story of us that came through really strongly in the speech and at the conference in general, which is one of their biggest strengths. Overall, these little snapshots from each of the battlegrounds that we work on paints a pretty scary picture of where our movements are at. So what do we do about it? I've broken this down into 4 areas that I think we really need to be shit hot if we have a chance of turning the tide, and some tips from Neon on how to do that. So, because we do this, spend most of our time thinking about this. So those areas are organising, political strategy, policies, and messaging. So I'm going to use the rest of my time to talk about that. Organising. The overall approach here, and again, if we're really going to go toe-to-toe with reform, we have to take this seriously, has to be defend and recruit. We defend by organising to keep our communities safe and block harmful policies, and then we make it our mission to broaden our base and recruit as many new people as possible. Every call that I'm on at the moment with CEOs of NGOs or kind of campaigning organizations is about 50% people hand-wringing about how good reform are at local organizing, and then 50% talking about why we couldn't possibly do it, and why it's so hard and complicated. And I'm not trying to downplay the really great work that is happening, unions and campaigning groups and community projects, but reform has a really strategic, joined-up organizing approach, which is both online and in communities, that is genuinely predicated on that very overused phrase, meeting people where they're at. So they're targeting areas, as we know, with failing public services. They go to bus stops where local routes have been cancelled and there's lots of pissed off, wet people waiting to get home. And they harness that energy and they sign them up and they say, come and meet me down the pub tomorrow. We're not really doing that. They're organising people on things that they care about, not trying to convince them of what they should care about, which I think is a lot of what we do, whether that's on just transition or any other range of issues. I think our organising efforts are about trying to influence and persuade rather than empower. I know that lots of people would argue that the problem here is that there's a distinct lack of a political vehicle to plug those efforts into, and we can debate that, and I'm sure we will. But if we're not basically doing that work of building power from the ground up and meeting people where they're at, then we really don't stand a chance. Political strategy, area 2 of 4. So as I'm sure we all agree, our movements need to bolster the left flank of party politics, however that by any means necessary. We know that power concedes nothing without a fight, so we need to operate on the 2 fronts, in the halls of power and outside in the streets. And this means supporting our ideas wherever they appear and finding champions where we can, rather than celebrating factionalism and constantly looking for things to critique, which we're very, very good at. Lots of good things are happening. Your party had over 800,000 sign-ups, which I'm sure James will talk about. Zach Polanski won the Green Leadership on a platform of economic and environmental populism. The soft left flank within Labour is gaining traction with the potential leadership. There's good stuff happening. And as a movement, we have to be getting behind that as a collective, getting behind them as a collective, even if they see each other as competitors, which largely I would argue that they do. Policies, almost there. So what are we fighting for? I really hate to sound like Keir Starmer, but we have to find policies that deliver. We have to actually deliver material change in people's lives that they're going to feel, and it has to happen quickly. Policies need to be a mix of income and outgoings focused. So getting more money into people's pockets and then taking less out of it again just to cover the cost of being alive. So that might look like capping care costs. It might look like tackling energy profiteering. It might look like introducing transport subsidies. We might pay for it by introducing a wealth tax, again, which I'm sure people will talk about. Equalising capital gains, which is my nerdy favourite pastime to argue that people would be an incredibly popular policy. Reevaluating our relationship with borrowing, since we're one of the few countries that can borrow in our own currency from a central bank. Just throwing things out there. These things aren't just morally right. They are really popular with the public. We poll on them all the time. We know that people like this stuff. And we also know that when people see their bills going down and their wages going up and their town getting investment, they will be less susceptible to scapegoating and the appeal of the far right. And ultimately, it's what Isabella Weber argues, anti-fascist economics. It boils down to, if you meet people's needs and you undercut the anger and desperation that keeps Nigel Farage's lights on, you're doing something right. Finally, messaging. Any policy intervention has to be narrative-led. We need an overarching story of us, just like Reform are really good at, that unites people into a clear us and a them, and makes it clear who's to blame for the mess we're in. And this was done really well in the States a few years ago. We basically need a combination of Obama's we and Bernie's them. That's what we have to nail. We need a progressive drain the swamp narrative, something from our side that asks what it means to have a higher standard of civic life and to hold our elected representatives to the standard. And then broadly, we need to stick by the key principles of a strong message, which came directly from my comms team, which I'm just going to share before I wrap up. So we lead with the shared values and vision. For example, no matter what you look like or where you come from, we all deserve respect and a chance to thrive. You name the problem and who's responsible. For example, energy giants are raising prices because they care more about profit than people. And then you offer a hopeful alternative and a solution. For example, if we tax those who can afford it, we can invest in schools, hospitals, and libraries, and then our communities will thrive. Research shows that when these kind of messages are used well, this formula actually outperforms the divisive stories of the far right. And when we tested these messages with people who are voting Reform at the moment, we found that they actually resonated more and neutralized the so-called anti-woke narratives of the right. So broadly, our job is to set the agenda, not just respond to theirs. So where does that leave us? I'm done. As I said at the beginning, our question at NEON is what can we win together and how do we do it? Hopefully some of my contributions have sparked some ideas about how we might get started. Thanks.
Awesome. Wonderful, thanks Aisha. That definitely is a good start for 10. We're going to move to James. James Schneider is the communications lead for the Progressive International and one of the people involved in setting up your party. So without further ado, James.
Will you tell me when I'm running out of time?
Sure.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah. Collective gets the job done. So I wasn't quite sure what to say to everybody this evening because policy means a lot of really quite different things. And when we say the word policy or program, we've got different ideas in our head. And one of those ideas, which I want to sort of argue against, is basically a kind of left technocratic idea of policy. So we develop very good ideas that in a perfect world where we were already in charge and had already built massive power, we could just do them. And I think sometimes when Jeremy was leader of the Labour Party, we were sometimes guilty of that. In fact, we were guilty of that. I remember one senior member of staff, not one of the ones who is wrongly a hate figure on the internet, so don't think that I'm saying one of them, came back from a meeting with senior civil servants in Access Talks in 2019. And I asked them, how did it go? And they said, it was amazing. It was so good. They're just desperate to deliver on our fantastic agenda. Thought, my God, you're completely demented. I mean, they're going to absolutely fucking kill us. I think, anyway, a lot of what we do, that doesn't mean that detailed good work doesn't need to be done. Autonomy does lots of extremely good, I mean, you do. And many others do very good detailed work. And we need to have that muscle. We need to have that skill because eventually at some point, our aim has to be to enter the state en masse with a lot of very skilled people who, rather than turning up, as unfortunately this Labour government have done, with like a 3-line plan and just hoping the civil servants will have gone, oh yeah, we'll turn that into something good, rather than turning up and be like, yes, Chancellor, have you thought about winter fuel cuts? And then just gone, right, fine, we'll do that. We need to have very, very detailed plans, but that's not enough. because when you are in the state, there's enormous counterforces weighed against you. The level of corporate control and influence and capture on the political media class, state class, is enormous, and we need to have sufficient, sufficient counterpower. But then there's another way of thinking about policy, which is basically as comms. The right do this a lot and very well, but that's because they don't want to change anything. So it's fine for them to only do that. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do some of that. Build the wall is a policy, sort of, but it's basically, strategic comms. And, that can be very effective from a left point of view, and it sort of doesn't matter what the underlying policies are, although they need to be there. Again, let's take the example from the Corbyn period. The 2019 manifesto was much better than the 2017 manifesto from a purely technical point of view. It was better worked out, huge amounts of more work had gone into it, it was a better program to change Britain. But it was way worse document with policy as comms. 2017, very simple. For the many, not the few, we're going to tax the rich and big business, and there'll be redistribution, more money for public services. I don't have a sentence for the 2019 manifesto in the same way, and I was doing comms for the party at the time. But also, comms is not enough. We do need the comms, and that also needs to be particularly simple. I think some of the points that we've already heard, that the other side has a very, very strong, very, very simple economic argument. It is the problem why you have real grievances, and your grievances are real, unlike what the political centre says, which claims that basically your grievances are fake, or they're a figment of your imagination, or they're somehow getting better, you just haven't noticed yet. The right, the far right, they say, no, really, our infrastructure really is crumbling, and there really is shit in our waters, and really you can't get a doctor's appointment, and your wages really are going down. But it's all the fault of Muslims, migrants, and minorities. And that is a great economic argument. It's a brilliant economic argument until a certain point, which I'll get to in a sec. It's a great economic argument because being a full-blown psychopathic racist is really a minority pursuit in our country. We're very lucky. Most people do not wake up in the morning and think, how can I be awful to Muslims, migrants, and minorities? But lots of people can be convinced of that argument, that that's the reason for economic hardship that they face, when there is no counter-argument. So our counter-argument and all of our policies that we are pushing need to fit into this in some way, needs to be as simple and as primary colours as that, which is basically tax the rich to make your life more affordable. I mean, everything can fit into that frame, but there's probably a second element to that, and this relates to the falsely named Unite the Kingdom, really Divide the Kingdom march on Saturday, which is that the ruling class are not just picking our pockets. There was some great research. See, I prove I do like policy. Great research from Commonwealth. Other think tanks are available this week about. There are two think tanks. Everyone else can get in the bin, and they had some very good research about the scam of privatization and how 200 billion had been paid to shareholders in that predatory operation for rail, mail, water, and energy, and buses. Buses are a good one to mention as well. So it's not just that the ruling class are picking our pockets; they're robbing us of our dignity. And it's not just the people that are under attack, Muslims, migrants, and minorities, who the ruling class wishes to rob of their dignity through attacking them. It is the people that they convince to attack them as well. Aimé Césaire, the great Martinican poet, in Discourses on Colonialism, has this brilliant bit about how colonialism dehumanizes the colonizer and robs the colonizer of their humanity. And you can see the same thing that is being done, again, with the Divide the Kingdom march. a great number of the people on that march, I've got no idea what percentage, I don't know, but certainly a great number of people on that march will be people who want to feel part of something, whose lives are difficult in a number of ways and want to be part of some kind of collective project and do something. And Elon Musk and the other people who have funded it and are driving it, and the basically psychopaths who are on the stage, are robbing them of their dignity by turning them against other people that they are fundamentally on the side of. But anyway, to move away from comms and questions of affordability and dignity, let's move to the question of power, because I think that's actually the most important thing, because we actually have loads of good ideas. The two aforementioned think tanks, other great individuals and collectives and trade union research departments, all the rest of it, have come up with lots of very good ideas. We aren't losing because we don't have good ideas. We're losing because we don't have any power. Because we are living now after 50 years of extraordinarily effective and vicious counter-revolution that has scrubbed away most of organized working class power in the global north and most of the capacity for sovereign development in the south. That is the fundamental reason why we're losing it. Of course, we can have better ideas. Of course, we can and must tell a better story. But fundamentally, it's about power and the point that you were making about organizing, which does involve meeting people where they are. So I'd like to think of policy as being something that comes out of that process of organizing. As Will mentioned, I'm involved in creating this new party. And I can't speak for it, I can't say exactly what it's going to do, but what I want it to be is a party that is serious about constructing our collective power. And I think you do that through three strategic things. The first is popular unity. So that means creating unity and alliances between the overwhelming majority of people that seeks to bring them into one line against the people that are ultimately picking their pockets and picking our pockets and robbing us of our human dignity. The second is building popular power. We know that all of our institutions of associational life and power that was organized in the workers' movement, a lot of it has been robbed away. There's tremendous opportunity to rebuild that. The need in society for connection, meaning, spaces where people can have agency, individual and collective, the need for it is so great. I mean, you can kind of see it fizzing in society, desperate need to in some way overcome alienation in the broadest sense of the word. I don't just mean in a kind of narrow sense at work. And that organizing, tenants unions, community kitchens, mental health groups, social centers, trade unions, all of these things are the vehicle, the underlying basis that will give us enough power so that when we get into government with an extremely detailed plan of how we are going to have a publicly owned pharmaceutical company and we can whack the civil servants over the head with it, but also we've got people being educated into that demand, to mobilize for that demand, and so on, that will have a counterpower against the corporate capture that we see, that we all know, which is why we don't live fully in a democracy, because of the huge level of corporate control over our political media and state class. And the third is generating a popular alternative. And I think the popular alternative has to come out of that process of organizing, of building structured organizations, democratic institutions, which are owned by the people within them. And the demands that come out of that are the things which should be at our forefront. Because I'm out of time, I'll end with one example, potential for that. I'm going to use the example of housing because only 38% of tenants voted at the last election. 38% of tenants. And if you're talking about building popular unity, which for me means working class people in working class jobs without assets, the downwardly mobile graduates, and racialized people, the biggest crossover is on tenants. So if you were looking to do that, there are three types of policies you need to deliver in government, and you have to get the balance right. But those three types of policies are: one, that redistribute immediately using the existing means that you have. The second I would call strong reforms, which are things which contend with capital's ability to seek profit. So, for example, nationalizing energy or water would be one of those. And non-reformist reforms, which are reforms, policies which point in the direction of the socialist running of society, a democratic planning for society. So, more cooperatives, workers having control over society, the democratic production of pharmaceuticals, whatever it might be. And through organising tenants, you could mobilise those for popular demands. The redistribution could be that council tenants' rents don't go up every year. Did you know that in the big fanfare about more money going into affordable housing that Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner announced, that included that rents would rise for council tenants above inflation every year for 10 years? So, a simple thing that could be taken away. The strong reform would be to scrap the bogus affordable housing and have a mass expansion of council housing. And the final one to say very quickly to run out of time is you could have a housing bank which could be capitalized by private sector tenants' deposits, which could then do your housing policy, build housing, so on and so forth. Anyway, just to finish on a final point, we need policy as worked out as part of social strategy. It needs to tell a very good, simple story. But most importantly of all, it needs to be useful for people who are doing organising to improve their lives in the here and now, because unless we are building hugely greater wells of social power in our society, even if we get into office, we won't really be in power.
Thanks, James. That also reminded me, this is how quick political time is moving right now, that when we started this series in July, we started on the day that Zach Polanski announced his leadership campaign. He was one of the speakers on the panel, and then your party hadn't even started yet. So I think this series is kind of captured within a small amount of time. Within that, a lot's changing. So I think, political time is moving quite quickly. Thanks for that. We're pushing us over, but I think that's okay. That's an apology accepted. Next, we have Antonia Jennings, who is the CEO of the Centre for London, which previously Antonia's worked, across the kind of progressive policy space, Centre for Local Economic Strategy, and also the Economic Change Unit. So a wonderful speaker to have with us. Thanks, Antonia. Please crack on.
Thank you. There is a third think tank. So as Will mentioned, I work for Centre for London, and just give you a very brief overview of why we exist, because we're quite unusual as a regionally bound think tank. Most think tanks have a thematic specialism: housing, health, transport, work, whatever it may be. But we were set up because London is an incredibly unique operating environment. We see a lot of sort of recommendations come out of national think tank work and research papers, but they don't translate into the London context. On top of that, we know, of course, there remains a very strong anti-London bias in Westminster. Levelling Up was just the latest of a series of brand names, essentially, that were coded to be an anti-London project. And thirdly, we know, given we are sort of in the UK, the home of financialisation of kind of the neoliberal experiment, all of our problems that we see across the UK are on hyperdrive in London. And indeed, like across a lot of the metrics of deprivation, it's London that is faring the worst. As Will mentioned, I have worked for the last few years prior to the Centre for London gig in different organisations concerned with progressive local economic development. So I thought I'd use this slot to talk a little bit more about what I think should happen in terms of local politics and local policy. Having said that, just like the other two speakers mentioned, when I was trying to put together remarks for this evening, I found it really, really hard to know where to start. Obviously, the headwinds against a progressive movement nationally and locally are very strong at the moment. And indeed, obviously, we've all seen what happened in London on Saturday. But the reason that I still fly the flag for kind of local action alongside, what's been alluded to by other speakers is there are still many, many more, in my opinion, local organisers, activists, and indeed elected politicians that are receptive to bold, radical ideas. And whilst kind of the remit of local government, of local councils, might be a lot smaller than the national government, we are in a space whereby we can cook up policy proposals, bring them to local council leaders, and they say yes, and we then move into the space of delivery. And I think that's a really important precursor to a national project. So when I was trying to put some notes together around what I was going to say, what kept coming back to me was an interview I did as part of a research project we've got going on at the moment with an ex-London council leader who was a council leader for coming up to 20 years and was pretty successful in fending off uprisings, I suppose, from the BNP, EDL, etc., in his local community. And he said throughout his time, his politics has been guided by an understanding that his constituents want three things. They want secure housing, they want their kids to be better off than them, and they want to feel respected by their local community. And I'm not saying that's the sum of what a sort of progressive politics and policy should offer, but I think when it comes to the local level, that's a good place to start. And I think it's a good diagnosis around what local economies currently aren't offering. And again, no more so than in the London context. So talking about them a bit in turn. So on our children being better off than us, we all know the stats around quality of life, around living standards in this country. For the first time since basically the Second World War, life expectancy has started to go down in this country. And we all know, the multitude of stats that sit under this umbrella, for example, the average income compared to the average price of a first-time home. So it feels like a lot of things are going backwards in this country, and at best you can say that living standards have stagnated for decades in this country, and indeed, as I've said, in many places are going backwards. So in my mind, kind of how to counter this on the local level, so much of this needs to be answered by and reversed by good quality public services. Again, I'm not to this audience going to give a kind of overview around the state of our public services. We all know the cuts that have been imposed across the board on local government, on public services as a whole. And we also know that whilst austerity has been ended on the national stage, sort of in name only, it has not been ended whatsoever on local councils and local public finances. So I'm not necessarily just going to fly the flag for, upping council funding back to kind of 2010 levels. That, of course, needs to happen. But I think what I see is missing from the debate, and something I'd be interested to get into as part of this discussion, is around the interrelation between our public services, or understanding or rhetoric or narrative around kind of the wider social contract, or indeed the case for the state. And I am definitely not a comms person, and appreciate that needs to be massively, commsified to kind of have any public salience. But the reason I say that is because at Centre for London, we run a regular poll of Londoners. We run it every quarter, and I've been doing the job for a couple of years, so we've done it about 8 times. And we poll Londoners on a whole variety of issues, from appetite for various policy suggestions, through to knowledge of their local politician, through to all sorts of other different things. One permanent question in that poll is, what matters to you most? And what you won't be surprised to hear is pretty consistently for the 2 years we've been running, well, it's been longer at Centre for London, but the 2 years I've been at Centre for London running this poll, consistently the 3 things that come up in terms of top of the list of Londoners' priorities, Londoners' concerns, are crime, cost of living, and housing. If you go later down the list, on the long bucket list of interrelated public services and offers from the state, you'll see community services, so youth clubs, libraries, etc. You'll see good quality local jobs. You'll see adult social care, mental health services, etc. And in my mind, something that's maybe missing a little from a progressive project in this country is making the case for how connected all these arms of the state are. We obviously know that, cost of living, crime, housing are directly connected to the cuts to youth centres, cuts to mental health services, and so on. And I think just as we campaign very well against privatisation in this country, I think there is space for us to make the case for the state, for the social contract. And I don't have a full idea around what that looks like, but I think putting forward the case for a holistic collection of services and, as I said, wider social contract is very important. I think one thing that can underpin that is making the case for long-term state investment. And that's something I worry we're losing the argument around at the moment. But interestingly, on the individual household level, the case has really been made and won to say that as an individual household, you make big borrowing decisions now to ensure your kind of prosperity later down the line, both for you and for your offspring. I don't know why we can't translate that into a sort of national government advocacy arm. I know, obviously, we're also the first to say household budget, not like the state budget, but I think there is a real clear parallel we can make between the fact that individuals do take out long-term debt to sort of ensure prosperity for future generations, and the state should do the same. In policy terms, we've seen an interesting example of that in practice in Wales. They, a few years ago, passed something called the Future Generations Act, which justifies or puts a new framework on top of any public policy interventions to make sure that they wash their face for future generations on kind of social, environmental, and equitable impacts. So on the housing side, so I'm presuming that most of us here tonight are living in London, so I probably don't need to tell you how awful the housing crisis is. We're probably all feeling it, whichever part of the crisis we sit in, from home ownership, through to trying to get a rental place. We also know that I mentioned financialisation at the start of what I was saying, and it's the financialisation of the housing market in London where we see the worst effects, and we also see a precedent for what is likely to come across other regional economies across the country. To give just a handful of stats to couch that in, London at the moment, when it comes to housing, highest levels of rough sleeping ever, most unaffordable housing market ever, highest levels of temporary accommodation ever. One child in every classroom, on average at the moment in London, is living in temporary accommodation. On the affordability side, once you factor in housing costs, and this feeds back to something I was saying earlier about the kind of anti-London bias that comes from Westminster, it obviously comes from a sense that London is the land of milk and honey, or streets paved with gold, etc. Once you factor into housing costs into Londoners' budgets, 1 in 4 Londoners live in poverty. That's amongst the highest level that we see in the country. So obviously, in short, we don't have enough secure housing, and I think a progressive project must look at the whole housing system. So too often, what I at least witness in housing policy is that a rough sleeping strategy is completely disconnected from changes to planning policy, which is completely disconnected to a temporary accommodation strategy. And I think we need to join them up, and I think we also need to raise the flag for the fact that I think somewhat lazily, there's maybe a sense sometimes that housing is somewhat done, as it is one of Labour's kind of headline missions, 1.5 million homes, but we really need to make the case for the fact that even if they build these 1.5 million homes, which in the London context, they won't, there's just too many barriers to making it happen, but even if they get it done, that is not going to scratch the sides of the affordability crisis. So we need to be having a sensible discussion around standards in the PRS, private rental sector, as well as all the other facets of the housing crisis. In terms of what that can look like, I think we need to make people more aware that things, demands in the housing space that are currently considered incredibly radical were very much active policy in this country until quite recently. So rent controls are often met with skepticism by more kind of insider or centrist types. Rent controls were in place in this country until the late 1980s. Similarly, I think we need to explore kind of marrying the housing debate with, again, other facets of the state's challenges. So Nye Bevan will all know famously as the founder of the NHS. His ministerial title was not just Minister for Health, it was Minister for Health and Housing. And that was justified in terms of a general consensus that fundamentally, you cannot have a healthy population unless they are housed well. So I think breaking out those silos, again, making the case for those kind of interdepartmental points of connectivity is really important. In terms of a very tangible policy call that we could do tomorrow in the housing space, it would be to redefine housing as essential infrastructure. It's a bit of a techie, policy wonky call, but essentially when it comes to the national grid or national rail or your utilities, the government can see these as essential infrastructure and essentially borrow against future profit that it will make from those investments. Housing is left off that list. And to that end, really, really limits the amount of money that the government can access to help the housing crisis. They've done it in Italy recently with huge success. There's no reason why we can't do it here. So finally, respect from community. Have I gone massively over time?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. Respect from community. Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult one. So obviously online has really changed what we mean by community. And there's a lot to be debated around what we do around kind of campaigning against sort of alt-right online community. But I just wanted to sort of fly the flag, pun intended, for making the case for local community and physical space that a progressive movement takes up. So a couple of things that I'll flag and then I will be quiet. But after the general election last year, so I'm signed up to all the parties' newsletters and I got reforms just 3 days after the general election. What did they announce? They announced we're setting up community organising units. And since then, from basically a standing start, they now run 10 councils. Compared to Labour that scrapped its community organising unit, initiative under the Starmer leadership, Labour in in local elections next May are set to lose up to 500 seats. I'm not saying these things are a direct Venn diagram, but there is something about being physically in spaces. And I worry that the far right is kind of hijacking and co-opting community, belonging, membership. And I think we rapidly need a left-wing alternative to that. So I have more in my notes, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Antonia. Right, we're going to jump straight into our next speaker, John McTernan, who I'm happy to say, happy to share a platform. I think at one time I was ill. We were going to share yes. So it's great to have you with us, John. John is a commentator and strategist who's been in and around politics for, it's safe to say 30 years, a political veteran. We are just over time, so I'm going to ask our last two speakers to try and stick to 10 minutes. You can blame the previous speakers and have a stern word with them afterwards for that reason. But if you could keep to 10 minutes, that'd be great. So we'd love to have more discussion with the audience as well. So John, over to you.
Yeah, so it's great to be here. Is this microphone working? Yeah, good. Look, I just wanted to reflect on where we are and why we're here. This is the first Labour government that has ever tried to govern solely from the right and not engaging with the left of the party. I think that's probably the primary reason for the difficulties that the government is in. Even Tony Blair had Marxism's day. Without Marxism's day, I think no new Labour. Without Stuart Hall, no new Labour. You look back, the first Labour government, you were talking about housing just now, the first Labour government had John Wheatley in 1924 from the ILP as a minister, housing minister. The legislation he passed led, in the 10 years after that Labour government in 1924, led to 500,000 council houses being built. That's a number we'd actually be happy for now, if we could imagine 500,000. So does it matter? Look, I think it massively matters. And we can sort of feel it. We heard it in some of the things you've been touching on, Aisha. This is a technocratic, transactional government, which is why I'm very strongly opposed to delivery and deliverology and all the stuff around delivery. I don't believe delivery is what our country needs. I think transformation is what is required because the scale of the challenges that we're facing. And I think because it's a technocratic, transactional government, I'll do a little bit here, a little bit there. You, the voters, will thank me. You'll become a block behind me. You'll vote for me. Keir probably, the operation probably would like to be seen as the heirs to Blair. They're the heirs to Rishi. I think you can look at the popularity of the Prime Minister, and you can say his popularity, personal approval rating has fallen faster than any Prime Minister ever. What he actually did was he just adopted, as soon as we came in, the unpopularity of Rishi Sunak. There's a continuity between the unpopularity of this Prime Minister and the previous Prime Minister, which leads to a question which is wrong. Is this country ungovernable? It's clearly not ungovernable. We're living in a world we've been living in for 20 years politically, a world in which the Labour Party can only win 34% of the vote. Tony Blair did it in 2005. He had a working majority of 60, 65. Jeremy Corbyn got 34% of the vote in 2019 and suffered a landslide defeat. Keir Starmer got 34%, actually slightly lower than 34%, but a lower vote than Jeremy Corbyn, and had a landslide victory. Something is shifting in the fragmentation of our politics, which means that votes, small shifts in votes, are magnified by first past the vote. I don't want to talk about electoral reform, but there's something going on. And we're in a situation today where there are currently 5 viable political parties. The Tories, Reform, Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens. On 5 parties, 21% is plurality. There's actually, in the wings, there's Die Linke, the Left Party, who could be another viable party. There's also nationalists in Scotland and Wales, although I think it's interesting that Scotland and Wales are seeing that Reform are a nationalist party too. They're a British nationalist party who are having some kind of impact. They're going to have a big impact in Scotland, overshadowed by the impact in Wales at the moment. And there's obviously, Elon Musk has decided that Nigel Farage is too woke for him, and he wants to put money and organisation behind another right party. So we could have 3 right parties, not just 2 right parties. So we're in this situation, and Nigel Farage, the most consequential politician of the last 30 years, 25, 30 years, he has consistently had 30% of the vote. Now, that doesn't deliver you anything except in a fragmented landscape. And when they've won and won well in European elections, when they've won and won well, it's been that 30% that's been brokered in some, because 30% is much better than the 23% that Labour is on, or the smaller numbers that other people are on. Labour still remains a strong brand. Despite the unpopularity of the Prime Minister, it can poll 23%. That's a very strong party brand. And until the May elections, Labour was neck and neck with Reform. The May elections were a moment that real votes cast by real voters gave other people permission to actually support Reform UK. There was a change in the dynamic of politics at that time. The core to the Labour brand is expanding the welfare state, new frontiers for the welfare state. That's why Bridget Phillipson talks about the breakfast clubs as part of her platform for deputy leader. It's not enough, and it is, of course, ironic that the breakfast clubs, as a movement globally, are the last remaining legacy, probably, of the Black Panther Party, which started breakfast clubs in 1968 in Oakland, in California. But we've got a Labour Party, and we could all discuss this as well as a different discussion. What's the core ideology of Labour? It's never been socialism. It's rarely been social democracy. It is Labourism, which has strengths and it has weaknesses. But that Labourism, go back to my starting point, that Labourism has always been tempered by the left of the party, and it has always tempered the left. And that negotiation, that debate has been the thing which has delivered the progressive change. The problem we've got at the moment, this isn't a time, I think it's been touched upon, this is not a time for technocracy. This is a time of huge global change, whether it is the continued rise of China, whether it is climate crisis, whether it is the looming threat of AI in the workplace, whether it is, you can run through a whole range of huge external things, and also you can run through, just over the last period, the huge external shocks we've had. Ukraine inflation, there is the Israeli aggression in Gaza, there is a whole range of external shocks which are coming into our politics as well. And in the heart of this, the Labour Party is having a deputy leadership election, which it wants to conduct as a shadow vote of confidence in its leader, but not as a discussion about what is needed to meet the moment. What is needed to meet the moment that's caused by the far right marching on the street, attracting a very, very significant following and requiring a reaction as powerful and as creative as Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League. But even as an old punk, I know it's not going to be based on any creative and cultural response. Is not going to be based on rock music. And there is something in the government and the Labour Party and the Labour movement that failed to rise the moment last year. After Southport, there were racist riots. Those racist rioters were caught and they were imprisoned. There were also counter demonstrations, and there was no move by the Labour Party to join with that movement. There was a movement starting then. So there was a movement which could have been organically connected to the government and the party, but it wasn't. And I think for me, that was a failure. But lurking behind all of our politics at the moment, in my view, since 2016, the voters have been calling for an end to neoliberalism. That is why they voted for Brexit. That is why they voted for Jeremy in 2017. That is why they voted for Boris in 2019. That's why they voted for Labour in 2024, for change. And every single time they ask to be released from neoliberalism, government and the two main parties say, do you know what? How about a little more neoliberalism? And I believe, they're going for reform whose very name means change. The change of the name was significant. And you've got a leader in Nigel Farage who wants to lift the two-child benefit cap, who did not support the cuts to PIP, who wants to nationalise British Steel. Whether that's a good idea or not, the question is he is playing with social democratic ideas. He is not. There is something moving around which, as a political entrepreneur, Nigel Farage is better able to spot and to try to exploit than the current government. And look, if you didn't know the age of neoliberalism was over, look at the attempt that's being made by Donald Trump to take over the central bank and unseat the high priests. And is it wrong to challenge central banks and the cult of central bankers? No, it's not. Is it worse to put Donald Trump in charge of the central bank? Yes. But he is asking some of the right questions and coming to the wrong answers. But there's something moving that requires a political response. I think, I'll finish on this, COVID changed everything. For all kinds of reasons, COVID showed the ability of government to put us in our homes, to finance us in our homes, to finance our business, to finance our wages, to finance the vaccine, to get a rollout, to move quickly and respond with vigor to a crisis. Come out of COVID, people are going, why can't you do that on housing? Why is there not the same imagination, the same force, the same drive on housing? And the only person in politics channeling that is Donald Trump with his executive orders. Again, destructive, but he's going, action is what is demanded in this moment. So responding to that. And so for me, there's something which is desiccated about delivery, because delivery is not about values. Delivery is not about purpose. The great and short-serving, short-lived New Zealand Labour Party leader Norman Kirk said, everybody wants somewhere to live, someone to love, and something to hope for. And that, for me, is the foundation of rebuilding a transformational politics.
Thanks, John, and thank you for keeping to time. I appreciate that. Right, moving on to our final speaker, Asad Raymond. Asad is Chief Executive of the Friends of the Earth, and I've known him since before that, when he was working for War on Want. So without further introduction, Asad, please take us away for our final talk.
Cheers, thank you. So maybe picking up on one of the sentences that John said. I'm always struck the climate scientists, they ended their last report with saying change is now inevitable. The only question is what kind of change? And obviously the answer is there is no change, right? I think like most people, who were out on the streets of London last Saturday, We all witnessed something very, very profound. Absolutely every racist was marching, but not everybody who marched was a racist. That was very, very clear. And there was a moment where there was a sort of elderly white couple with a Union Jack on a balcony, and the march was going past, and people started shouting at this elderly couple, you know, all the old slogans from the 1970s we had. And I just looked and said, we've just driven another two people into arms of the far right. That's not the story. That's not saying these things. We're not in 1970. We're not even in the year 2000 when we stopped the Rights for Whites campaign here across the field at Weavers Field. We're just not there. Actually saying things like you're a Nazi has nothing. In fact, I think that generally the currency of accusing people of being racist is so diminished now, you know, from both the sort of, you know, when you're accusing people because of genocide in Palestine, right through to how weaponizing it's come, I think people just go, well, I don't care anymore. I really don't care. So there's a real big question for us, right? And you know, Freddie was asking, you know, I've just come from the Stop Trump march, and it's interesting, right? We marched, and of course, lots of reasons why this demo was much smaller, but let's say it was about 10,000. If you remember 2018, we had hundreds of thousands of people, right? It's because also racism has become just so normalized. Trump is normal. Everything is normal. You know, the normal, what is normal is no longer, you know, what we shocked us before. And last year when the riots took place, I was looking at those places and I was thinking, you know, those are communities that I once was like going and standing in pickets during the miners' strike. And those are the communities that in 1976 stood with Asian striking workers at Grunwick. That's where the 10,000 miners went. And now those same communities are standing outside migrant hostels, shouting all this. And the left is calling for those people to go to prison. I was like, I don't want them to go to prison. I don't think that's the answer. And I'm originally from Burnley, and I look at my hometown and I think everything that made that place has gone, right? The unions, they're not there. They're not there. I mean, you might get NEU at the schools, you've got the NH, you've got in local authority and unison. Industrial unions are gone. Community organizations, no community organizations. There's service organizations. There's nothing. Even like working men's clubs, the brass bands, anything that told you a story of who you were and where you came from has gone. And in the absence of that, there's other people telling stories. And that story, and we can talk about, you know, of course, the power of the right, algorithms, the money they've got behind, how they're speaking to those communities in a language that we have struggled with. And of course, absolutely, it's much easier to blame Mr. Khan, the shopkeeper, and the migrants than tell our complex stories. This economic system, it's all these blah, 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 blah. You know, you bore everybody to death. We can't, and we're really bad because we want to be correct in everything we say. So we don't want to do short, sharp kind of messaging. We say, no, we must tell everything. Hold on a minute. Give me an hour of your time and I'll explain why you are wrong, right? Because you are wrong. And that's the left's attitude to everything. You are wrong, and I'm going to convince you to be like me. And I think I always look at the right, and I think the right are way more inclusive than we are. Way more. They don't say to people, you're wrong. They say, come, whatever you are, come on a journey with us. And I think there's really fascinating studies in the US about how the right create a sense of community. They don't go on the politics of what you are, and in that sense of community, they transform people. And there's lessons for us to think about in terms of that. And like we said, we've got no shortage of technical policies, absolutely no shortage of all the things that we want to do. And I've been thinking a lot around this question. And of course, you know, we see how the right are weaponizing all sorts of different things. Of course, migrants, now climate versus inequality and etc. And we all fear that what's going to come in the next, well, in May elections and then in 4 years' time may very well be, not that the reform is going to win the election, but maybe will be a significant party. But we also know they don't need to win an election to shape the narrative and politics because they've shifted everybody, right? And I'm always reminded of a quote by Jean-Marie Le Pen, the original father, in 1982 when he was studying election against Mitterrand. And he said, it's not about defeating us. We've already won. Because those left, you're now arguing on our terrain. And there will come a time when people will say, why vote for the copy when I can vote for the real thing? And of course, we know that simply the government reinforcing and normalizing frames around migrants, all of those, you can never outright the right? You can never do that. And of course, that's a bit of disaster. So thinking about these is actually what led me back to Friends of the Earth. Because I have been thinking, what do we need to do when we face this challenge, which is, for me, the greatest challenge we faced for the last 40 years, right? In terms of the rise of this kind of right-wing phenomenon and force and the real crisis that people are facing. Many years ago, when the Gilets jaunes first went out and had that banner, elites worry about the end of the world, we ordinary people worry about the end of the month. I used to send that to every environmental justice and environmentalist. Say, we have to answer that question. If we don't answer that question, people are going to say, we're creating that inequality. And exactly that is what Farage and Reform and the Right are managing to do. So how do we talk about that? Well, to me, actually, the whole strategy we've got to have is actually about a place-based strategy. It's got to be local. And of course, we've got to have national narratives, and we do all of those things. But we are facing lots of communities that have just been hollowed out of anything, and we're not there. And we should be honest that progressive forces are not in many working class areas anymore. Why? We're in urban areas, we're in all those, we're comfortable, right? Even in urban areas, we're in our nice cafes together, we're in nice communities together. It's who we engage with. I always used to say, probably the closest most people of some of the progressive left come to the working classes when they go to the Turkish grocery shop or go on a bus. Because how are we connected to the communities which we're in? Actually, to a large part, we don't connect within the communities we live. We're not part of building the community organisations, the infrastructure that used to be there. When we drove the BNP and the National Front out of East London, we had things like tenants associations you could go to. You tried to identify who were the key people who had power locally and try to connect them and bring them together. I think if we try to do now, I'm not sure who you try and work with. Who are the people and the institutions that you need to try and do that? So of course, as we've just heard, I think the first thing we've got to do is the story. And we all know it's the story. They have a story. We have facts. And I always say, facts never change the world, stories do. Stories have always changed the world. And we do not have a story that puts people in it and understands where people are, right? And understands their grievances of where they are. I think we're still very, very sort of arrogant and paternalistic about the very class and working people that we purport to be most allied with and speak. I think the message, absolutely, but also the messengers. I don't think the left, I count myself these days, we're the best people to be the messengers. And to have that and recognize that actually means a strategy that you have to adopt. And going back, that's why I looked at this moment last year and I said, what is it that we could try and do? And I looked around and I thought, I'm either a really radical organization, war on want, I can say what I want, I can do all of these things. But you know what Friends of the Earth have got? They've got 230 local groups. They've got local groups, people who live in a community up and down this country in red wall places. They've got a brand and they've got hundreds of thousands of supporters. So how can we use that to begin to think about how do you connect with people no longer at the factory gate, at the school gate? I saw a opinion poll of the thing, you may have seen it a few weeks ago. Somebody was asked, I think one of the opinion polls asked the question, who do you trust with your bag? Right? Do you trust Kemi Badenoch, Nigel Farage, Keir Starmer? And the majority of people said, I don't trust any of them with my bag. Who do you trust with your bag? I trust my neighbour. I trust the GP. And everybody they associated, who they trusted, was all local. And that again just means saying, so this is going to be a local fight. You have to weave a story. So how do we do it? And when you look back, I always say this, you look back to the Bolsheviks, to anybody, nobody ever fucking built a revolution or a struggle on what is Lenin's, what is to be done. They built it on slogans of peace, bread, land. I look at how the Islamists grow. They don't build it on like Sharia law. They don't build it on complex questions. They build it on, we're going to give you justice in a world where everything is unjust, and we're going to give you bread. You look at the anti-imperialist movements of the 70s. We had Roti Kapra Makan, house, clothes, food. And I look at this and think, what would the equivalent be for us? And I think it's absolutely right. Housing has got to be absolutely critical. But it's not things like warm homes or things, because we struggle with that. I mean, even Friends of the Earth have been running a campaign on warm homes. And most people think you're selling them insulation, right? They do, because I think the goal is right, but that's not where people are. Actually, we maybe need to talk about housing in a way that you talked about. It's a right to housing, right? That's what we've actually got to start with. And then say, we've got the policies that follow it, but it's not, let's not try and build power on the policy. Let's build power on a story around these 2-3 things, not everything. Look, I'm a climate campaigner. I'm always been saying, how can you build a climate campaign around saying no to fossil fuels when majority of people's relationship with energy is, I want to switch that light bulb, I want electricity, and I want to be able to afford my bill at the end of the day. It means nothing. Actually saying to people, that solar panel on your school, that money should come to you and your community. Actually, ownership about assets. Maybe that's the way in which we begin to weave 1, 2, 3 things. And what's the local fight? What are the real things that make people angry at a local level? How do we weave that together and put that in and say, actually, you know what? We have to rebuild community institutions. We have to rebuild a vision of we that is different from the vision of we that the far right are able to put forward. Because when I looked at that demonstration on Saturday, what really saddened me was like, you should be marching with us. Half of you should be marching with us because you're angry about the same things that we're angry about. And why have we failed? And that's our failure, right? It's not their failure. It's our failure that we've not been able to craft something that speaks to them. So I'm going to finish because I'll probably run out of time. I'm going to just finish it. I think the first and most important strategy has got to be build power. How do we build power? Who needs to be in our coalition to be able to build power? How do we make sure that the bar to building that power and that coalition is not up here, but is actually here? Then that, and how do we engage? What is the strategies we've got to engage in? How do you rebuild and put community organizers in communities? How do you say, this was the politics of the anti-racist movement, the race and class movement of the 70s and 80s, when we said, return to your community and become community organizers. Build institutions in your communities. All of these things. This Oxford House was fought for by communities. Everything we have still got, last remnants, came because of actual people saying, we have to organize as communities. And I think that's one thing we've got to do in terms of community organizers. Then I think we have to think about the fights, right? And I think it's really interesting because look at Reform won Lancashire, right? Lancashire County Council. And whilst at the same time Farage is talking about fracking, Lancashire County Council passes a motion saying, we're going to ban fracking in Lancashire. Why? Because they even know that in Lancashire, we ran so many community campaigns against fracking that their own base was against this. So I look at that base and I think, these are all people that are winnable to us. They're all people. They are not the people that we do. Now, I'll just end one last thing. All of our strategy in the 70s and 2000s was you break the fascists from the racists, and therefore you don't allow them to strength. The problem is you cannot do that anymore because they've got social media and algorithms. So it's no longer a strategy of breaking the fascists from the racists. I think we have to think beyond that. I'm not sure how we do that. And that's, of course, I think the biggest conversation we need to have. How do we, knowing what we're against, that this power of social media and algorithms, which is beyond, the only answer I have to that is the power that we have face to face. So we have to construct things that allow us to bring people together. And that, for me, is like micro, mini fights around simple things like you should have a playground for your kids. You should have these things. And that often feels very reformist when we all think we need massive transformation. But actually, to me, that is the transformation. It's imagining people and reminding them of the agency and power that we have collectively.
Thanks, Asad. Thanks to all our speakers.